Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sue Nakanishi from the Langland Adams in Groveland, Massachusetts, and thank you, Robert Hayes of the Tewksbury Library in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. And Robert mentioned, but for those latecomers, if you have any questions, please use the chat. To my live audience, we will be doing it at the end of Michael's presentation, so just hold your thoughts and questions until he's finished. An established expert in intelligence and foreign affairs, our guest author this afternoon retired from the CIA in 2021 after 20 years of serving as an analyst and counterterrorism targeting officer in locations ranging from Washington, D.C., the South and Central Asia, and the Middle East. He holds undergraduate degrees in political science and history from the University of Illinois and graduate degrees from Missouri State University and Indiana University. He's published 2 academic books and several journal articles about World War II and current security issues in the former Soviet Union. He currently lives in Texas, but he's broadcasting live from the Ukraine, and it's 9 o'clock at night there. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Mike Croissant.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight, or today, I should say. It's nighttime for me. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to tell you about my book that came out in March called Bombing Hitler's Hometown. This started for me as a family mystery. My family is from Central Illinois, a family of 9 children, and one of them was a bombardier during World War II. He went through the war without a scratch, 21 combat missions. And unfortunately, when he came home, he was given a chance on short notice to hop on a plane, to fly to Wisconsin, and then take a train onward to Illinois. This was just after the war ended, and his plane crashed, killing all aboard. I never knew my uncle. I knew of him, but I didn't know very much at all. So in my 20s and early 30s, I started to become curious. I got my father talking about him. My father and he were very close. And to make a long story short, the dam sort of burst in around 2008, 2009. I bought the crash report that the U.S. Air Forces, Army Air Forces put out about the wreck. I wrote a report for my family. They had never been given a satisfactory answer for why my uncle was taken from us at age 22. So I did my own sort of investigation and tried to give them some peace of mind. And that just got me more and more curious. Eventually, I was gifted his letters from the war. I obtained this much better photo of his crew. This is Ellsworth Croissant. He was the bombardier. His bomb group operated out of Italy. When I obtained his wartime letters, I approached it very analytically. And not only was I trying to learn about my uncle as a person, but I was curious about what he did in the war. So I went through the letters and I was able to deduct most of the combat missions that he went on. He went on 21 missions. For each target, I would look at the target. Why did we bomb it? Was there anything historically or culturally significant about that city or whatever the target was closest to? And I'm going through the list, places like Vienna that you've probably all heard of, Prague, and then I come to Linz, Austria, and this is not one that I knew. Well, I did a little digging, and what do you know? Linz is the town that Adolf Hitler considered his home. Just to put it visually here for you, this is a map from 1943. Linz is located in north central Austria. It's the 3rd largest city in Austria. It was then and is now. Back then, it had a population of about 600,000. And I wish I had my laser pointer, but I don't. The 15th Air Force was operating out of the boot of Italy, sort of down by where the spur on the boot is. So this was a fairly long distance mission that we're going to talk about today. Anyway, Adolf Hitler and Linz. This is a photo from 1900. Adolf Hitler was 11 years old. He was born in Austria, just inside the border with Germany. His family moved around a lot, and right around age 9, they settled in or near Linz, Austria, and lived there for about the next 9 or 10 years. So essentially, Hitler spends his adolescence in Linz, Austria. He faces some formative experiences in his life while living in Linz. Both of his parents die, his baby brother dies, and he is also exposed to German nationalist ideas for the first time. And this school photo, this school in particular, is one where he was first exposed to those ideas. Now we're going to skip ahead in history to March 1938. I think many of us know what happens in the years in between those photos, but Hitler has now become the Chancellor of Nazi Germany. In March 1938, he enters Austria at the head of a conquering army. He pauses at his parents' grave to pay his respects, and then the column makes a beeline for Linz. This photo is an extraordinary one from that night. The photo is taken in the Linz main town square. According to eyewitnesses, there's about 70 or 80,000 people in attendance, which is larger than the population of the city. Mobs have thronged his motorcade the entire way, but when he gets to the town, he takes position on this balcony, which is, by the way, still there, untouched, and gives a short address to the crowd. The crowd goes absolutely wild, and Hitler is so overtaken by the response that he decides, according to several scholars, to take over all of Austria at that time. Now, Hitler, growing up, really didn't like a lot of the structures in Linz. You know, he was interested in architecture and art, and he would spend his days oftentimes strolling through the city, sketching in his notebook, and putting down on paper what he would do with Linz were he given the opportunity. Well, now he has that opportunity. He essentially seeks to remake Linz into the cultural capital of Europe. Among other things, he wants to build a new opera hall. He wants to build a tomb where his parents and then later he would be buried. And he wants to build a new museum named after himself, of course, the Führer Museum. And in that museum would go all of the precious works of art that his minions would soon begin stealing from the four corners of Europe. In order to pay for all this, though, Hitler has to raise tax revenue. So he goes about industrializing Linz. Up to this point, Linz had been more of a rural economy, but he sets about industrialization. This is a map from the book. The Hermann Göring Works, which is a steel and iron factory, is built in the eastern part of Linz. As you can see, the Danube River snakes around the city. It's been a commercial point of interest for centuries, going way back to Roman times, due to its location on the Danube. So Hitler builds the Göring Works, and as the war begins and soon turns against the Germans, at the Göring Works, they begin producing armaments, and in particular tanks. There is also some production of naval assets on the Danube. To go along with that, Linz's already formidable rail system is greatly expanded. So as you can see here, Linz becomes a valid military target. And on July 25th, 1944, the 15th Air Force, operating out of Italy, begins its first raid. There would go on to be 22 raids against Linz. This is the first one. This is an actual photo from that day. You can see the Danube River snaking around the city. And if you look closely in the center of the photo at the bottom, you can see the Göring Works burning. I did interview a man on one of these bombers. He came back from the raid with 2 fewer fingers due to a German fighter. We're going to fast forward again. Now we're talking about the spring of 1945. The war has long since turned against the Germans, and the Allies are closing in. From the east are approaching the Soviets, and from the west, the Americans, in particular, George Patton's Third Army. Now, on April 12th and 13th, 1945, Vienna, the capital of Austria, former capital of Austria, falls to the Soviets. Unfortunately for our men, the anti-aircraft artillery guns that were once defending Vienna are successfully withdrawn, and they are placed in Linz. Linz had a reputation in the 15th Air Force as a very tough target. It was always very well defended due to the rail system there. So when American reconnaissance planes are dispatched in the latter part of April 1945, they come back with grim news for our airmen. The number of anti-aircraft artillery guns, have grown by almost 50%. So the men who once faced a very tough target in Linz are going to face even worse. So on April the 25th, let me back up 1 second. The same reconnaissance photos show that the Linz rail system is full of about 2,000 rail cars full of presumed munitions and supplies that would be used to prolong the war. That cannot stand. So the 15th Air Force dispatches about 500 bombers to end the Linz rail system once and for all. Now, the airmen know they're facing a rough day. Those who have been there know that it's tough. They know it's going to be even worse today because more guns protect Linz than normal. I, in many years of research, never found a photo of what the sky looked like that day. This is the closest I could come. What you're looking at here is a photo looking out the waist window of an American B-24 heavy bomber. Those black puffs of smoke are explosions of 88 millimeter anti-aircraft artillery shells. When one of those explodes, it shreds the shell, the metal shell, into tiny, jagged, burning hot pieces of metal that we call flak or shrapnel. And the idea is that these would be shot up in front of the formation of bombers, that they would strike the aircraft, which are made of aluminum. They're very thin-skinned, and cause enough damage to divert the men. And no, there were no illusions that every bomber could be shot down, or even a significant number. The idea was to disrupt the aim of the bombardiers and therefore reduce the damage to the target. So what we're looking at in this photo would be considered a fairly heavy barrage, but the men that I interviewed described something far more ominous. In particular, this crew. These men called themselves the Roger or the Lodger crew. They named themselves, they named their bomber Roger the Lodger after a somewhat naughty limerick that I will not repeat. But I did interview 3 of these men, including this man, John Dominy. John Dominy was the ball turret gunner. The ball turret is a spherical dual machine gun turret underneath the belly of the bomber. Both the B-24s and the B-17 Flying Fortresses had them. It's a tiny little thing that a man can barely fit into. John, who went by the nickname Duck because he could perfectly imitate Donald Duck, he did it with me, was in his ball turret. He shouldn't have even been there that day. The night before, he was in line for a shower at his bomb group area. The man before him used up all the hot water, so he had no choice but to take a really fast, really cold shower. And in doing so, in his haste, he slips on the soapy floor and injures his shoulder. Now, John is a tough guy, and he doesn't want to set out the mission. He knows the war is almost over, and he wants to finish it with his buddies. So he goes on the mission anyway, and he ends up in his ball turret scanning the skies for fighters when he hears the nose turret gunner call out flak 12 o'clock level. For us civilians, that means straight ahead of the bomber at eye level is a flak barrage. So John rotates his turret, and what he sees scares him to death, nearly. He says he wrote this later. He wrote, "I knew that I was going to die. The flak was like a solid black wall." And this is a sentiment that almost all of the 55 men that I interviewed for the book repeated. What they saw was unlike anything they could imagine. John sees the flak barrage and he thinks he's going to die. He thinks he has minutes left in his life. So he begins the Lord's Prayer. And he knows he doesn't have time to finish it. So he asks God, "Will you have me?" And the message he gets back fills him with peace. And within seconds, the bomber enters the flak field. And a few minutes later, his bomber is struck in multiple places. Men are wounded, and they would end up parachuting to the earth and being captured by the Germans. In the end, 15 bombers would go down this day, which was a very, very heavy price to pay at this late stage of the war. And 28 Americans would be killed. Remarkably, 70 years after the fact, I was able to get firsthand accounts from 6 of those 15 bombers. I did interviews with men on 6 of them, and I acquired accounts from all 15 from either interviews or records from that period. So I'm not going to go through all of them. Fortunately for you, some of them are quite horrific, but I am going to give you a sample of what the men went through. So case in point, this is an extraordinary photo that I came across in my research. It's not in the book. The publisher would not let me use it because we couldn't attribute who took the photo and therefore would be exposed to potential copyright issues. But anyway, what you see here is a bomber making emergency landing in Hungary. I interviewed the pilot and another man on board. They were devastated over the target and could not stay airborne. They were made aware of an emergency landing field in Hungary controlled by the Soviet Union. And they made a beeline there. You can see the field at the bottom. It's sort of a dark smudge. If you look closely, however, there's another bomber. The man in that bomber, the pilot, did not spot the field and could not hold the aircraft airborne in time to make an approach. Their aircraft makes a very ugly crash landing. The pilot, whose daughter I believe may be in the audience tonight, hello Diane, he breaks his nose on impact. The men are bruised and battered, but they all make it. Both of these crews end up in the custody of the Soviets, and they would be 2 of the 6 crews that went down that day that ended up in Soviet custody. Now, the Soviets, often used interchangeably with the term Russians, were the allies of the United States and Great Britain and others during the war, and for the most part held up their obligations to care for our men, including the men in the 2 bombers here. But in one case, they performed horribly in that role, to put it mildly. This man is one of the main characters in the book. His story is enraging and it's awful, and it's told here for the first time. Dale Shabilsky is a 20-year-old Omaha native. He has been a radio operator. He's very near the end of his combat tour. At this point in the war, a man had to survive 35 missions into enemy territory to be able to go home. Today is his 33rd. He can see the finish line. He is over the target, sitting at his post at the radio station, which is just behind the cockpit on a B-24 Liberator. The aircraft is being hit front to back with shrapnel. The bomb load is dropped over the target. He knows that because the aircraft is suddenly much lighter. The aircraft rises. One of his jobs as a radio operator is to visually inspect the bomb racks to make sure that all of the bombs had actually fallen out. You don't want to be flying around with a bomb stuck in the bomb bay. So as he does that, he turns to look back at the bomb rack right as a puff of smoke enters. A split second later, the concussion wave hits him. and he is blown off of his feet. Dale gathers the senses, gets back to his feet, and returns to his duties. And very shortly after that, he goes to brush away what he thinks is sweat from above his eye, and his glove comes back red. He's been essentially shot in the head. He's taken a wound from shrapnel to the eye. He would learn later that he's also been struck in the buttocks. The aircraft is damaged severely and they cannot stay airborne. They make a beeline for Hungary and make a crash landing in a farmer's field outside of the town called Győr. Hungarians rush the aircraft to provide assistance. Fortunately, they are friendly Hungarians. They take the uninjured members of the crew in one direction, and there are two injured members, Dale and the tail gunner. They take each of those in different directions. They place Dale in a church and bring a doctor who performs an unanesthetized procedure to close his wounds. And then Dale essentially walks to Budapest in the company of other Hungarians. They persuade upon him to destroy his American uniform and identity papers, which, as we will see, was a very bad decision. He keeps only his dog tags and his .45 caliber pistol. They walk to Budapest, and standing there at the river's edge, spy a Soviet patrol approaching. And they part ways. Dale, all alone now, gives himself over to the Soviet patrol. They approach him. He has his hands in the air in a gesture of surrender, and he's saying in Russian, Amerikansky, Amerikansky, meaning American. Well, the Russians see this young man. He's of Polish descent. He's pale-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and they accuse him of being a German spy. They very quickly start to beat him. They beat him as he literally crawls across the field to a building where for the next few days he is tortured. I won't go into it further. It's retold graphically in the book, but the things this man went through are unimaginable. He will later prevail upon the Soviet authorities to give him back over to the United States. He actually transited Kiev, where I am today. So I've been thinking about him ever since I got here. And he would later be sent to Odessa, down on the Black Sea, and then sent back to Italy. I'll tell you more about Dale later on. So the B-24s, those are the bombers shown there at the top. They constitute the majority of the bombers in the 15th Air Force. Their portion of the raid ends, and B-17 Flying Fortresses bring up the rear, if you will. This is another extraordinary photo that I was not allowed to use in the book, but nonetheless one that has taken me on quite an adventure. I did obtain this photo a few years before my second research trip to Austria. I went to Austria twice to research the book. In 2019, I went and I was sitting in a museum in Ruhr, Austria, going through the research of a wonderful Austrian man who had dedicated much of his adult life to locating the crash sites of American bombers in Austria. And I come across the photo, and again, I had already seen it, but the museum curator saw me staring at the photo, and he says, "You know what? I know where that is." So my Austrian guide and I look at each other, and without even having to say anything, we decide to drive over there. And we did. We pulled up into this Austrian village named Mulbach, which I have to imagine looks probably very much like it did back then. It's one of those areas that seems untouched by time. We pulled off to the side of the road, and my guide started to speak with an Austrian man. Excuse me, and what do you know? He knew exactly where this crash site was. So he hops in the car, and we drive a minute or two to a tiny, tiny village. And next thing you know, I am standing where the bomber came down. The structure in the background there was in 1945 a kindergarten. It is still there today. You can't see it, but in the foreground is a house. The Austrian family invited us in and treated us to cake and tea. They have a photo of this bomber crash in a frame by their front door. So it got even more interesting. The man who led us here says, you know what, I know a man who witnessed this. Do you want me to go get him? Of course, the answer is yes. So he goes and returns a few minutes later with the man pictured on the right, Franz Kropik. He was 11 years old on April 25th, 1945. He, for whatever reason, didn't have school that day, so he was out playing with his buddies when this bomber appeared over his village. And he told me exactly what happened, what he saw. He was the second one on the site. Only his teacher beat him there. And he told me all about it. It was just one of those moments where you have to pinch yourself to believe it's actually happening. And just maybe one or two houses down the hill from the crash site, there's the tire from that bomber still sitting there in the backyard of an abandoned house. And yours truly may or may not have used a pocket knife to cut off a piece of that tire for posterity. And believe me, that's not easy to cut through with a pocket knife. Those tires are made to last. Again, I'm skipping over many of the bombers that were shot down, and that's not out of any disrespect for the men or for what they went through, but it's strictly for time. The last bomber to go down that day is another tragic, horrific case. It's under the command of Robert Sinton of the 483rd Bomb Group. They're at the very back of the formation. The bomber is absolutely annihilated in the air. Several men are wounded on the plane. One man's parachute is damaged and partially deploys inside the aircraft. This man, Herbie Westerlund, whom I interviewed, and those who could bail out, 2 men on the aircraft are deceased. There's no easy way to describe what happens, so I'll just say it. The man whose parachute didn't fully deploy falls to his death. All of the men are shot at from the ground by people with rifles. I believe it's I'm sorry, I don't recall which position he played. He was on the aircraft, but he took a bullet under the chin and it exited through his head, so he was deceased. Those who survived the descent by parachute landed in or near Mauthausen. Many of you may know it. It's the most notorious concentration camp in Austria. It's a murder factory. The photos there are the ones that I took in 2019. The men are taken inside and placed in front of the Wall of Lamentations, which is the photo at the bottom. That's the name given to it by the Jews who were taken in there. They would all undergo their introduction to their new lives at the camp at this wall. The men are lined up and for several hours are spat upon, cursed at, slapped, degraded, and mistreated. It's a war crime to do this, by the way. All of this is done at the hands of the deputy camp commandant himself. The slapping and abuse goes on for hours, as I said, before 2 of the deceased are brought in. They would later be cremated in the crematorium. And today, their final resting place is here. This is Aschenfriedhof. I apologize if I mispronounce it. I'm not a German speaker. It's the Ash Cemetery. This entire mound right outside the fence of the Mauthausen Memorial is made of human ash. So 2 brave Americans rest there, along with the remains of thousands and thousands of Jews. The raid, fortunately, is a wild success. The target is completely annihilated. And on May 5th, Patton's Third Army enters Linz and ends 7 years of Nazi occupation. This is a photo of what's left of the rail system. They put it out of commission. Linz would go on to receive millions and millions of dollars in aid through the Marshall Plan. The rail system is resurrected. I took this photo in 2012 from a road overpass, which, by the way, one of my uncle's bombs actually struck. I have a photo. So it was a very poignant moment for me. You can't see it in this photo, but just to the left would be where the Hermann Goering Works once operated. It's since been rebuilt. It's called something else, of course. But Linz has reprised its role as a center of industry. Now I finished the narrative about what happened on the mission and what happened to the men who were shot down. Probably within a few years. I started writing in 2012. Within a few years, the American story, I felt I had a pretty good grasp of. But I was not satisfied. I wanted to at least try to tell some of the Austrian side, the people under the bombs. So I did that. I interviewed probably a half dozen who were under the bombs, including this beautiful young lady. Her name is Anna. I met her in 2019 when I visited. She was 5 years old that day. She was in kindergarten. And, to this day, she has PTSD. She described to me how the civil defense sirens would go off as the bombers were approaching, how she would be sent home from school. She would walk home holding hands with her best friend, and they would take shelter in the basement of her apartment. She described that there was a single light bulb dangling from a wire, and it would sway as the bombs hit. I also interviewed some who were shooting at our men, believe it or not, on the 80th anniversary of the beginning of World War II. In his home in Austria, I interviewed a former member of the Hitler Youth. This is Franz Schützeneder, who sadly passed away late last year. He was compelled to drop out of school and join the Luftwaffe when he was in high school. His entire class was a student one day and aerial gunners the next day. Franz is one of the child soldiers in that picture. He obviously survived the war. He nearly died at the end due to some medical issues he was having due to the breakdown of sanitation, but charming man who was wonderful to speak with. Now, the men who survived the mission weren't the same before. Weren't the same again. The men that they were when they took off that day were changed. The German barrage was so ferocious that it changed them. This is Hal Millet. Hal, I became very close with. He is a certifiable genius. He's an IQ of about 160. And he was also an atheist. So this is a man who tried to think his way through the war. He was also a ball turret gunner. I spoke of that earlier. So he would be confined in this tiny space for hours at a time. And, where some men would turn to prayer or to other things like that. Hal turned to, it sounds weird, but he would focus on the worst things that could possibly happen to him in the ball turret. What if the oxygen connection that he relies on to stay alive at these altitudes goes out? What if he's struck by shrapnel and can't stop the bleeding? What if the door to his turret is damaged and he can't get out? On and on and on. And then he would try to come up with a solution for each problem. And this is how this man spent hours of his life as a teenager. Hal turned 19 years old over Vienna, Austria, which was a very tough target. He, like I said, had no prayer to turn to. And on the mission, the bomber next to his takes a direct hit and explodes. The concussion wave catches under the wing of his aircraft and they go into a nosedive. He thinks they're going to die. But fortunately, they don't. The pilots pull out of the dive and they make it back. But Hal decides right then and there on his 19th birthday to come up with a new creed in life. And that is, I'm paraphrasing, the best thing that can happen to me is that the worst thing won't happen to me. My friends, I don't know what you were doing on your 19th birthday, but it was nothing like that. I was doing something stupid probably, but it was a deadly serious affair for Hal. And he lived by that credo for the rest of his life. He did have, almost certainly have PTSD. We spent hours and hours together on the phone and in his den there, which you can see on the right, just going through it all. And this man locked away all of his memories from the war. He's a computer guy, so he described it as putting his memories on a part of a computer that could be sequestered, so they could not easily be accessed. And they remained there for decades. It wasn't until the late 1990s or early 2000s that his daughter prevailed upon him to begin opening himself up to revisiting his World War II years. And he did so very slowly and deliberately. The crew would have a reunion in 2002. And Hal found that most of them had a similar problem with their memories. They just locked everything away, never talked about it. And it all kind of came flooding back to all of them. And when Hal got home from the reunion, he had somewhat of an emotional breakdown because everything came flooding back. I caught Hal in his twilight years. I think he was about 87 when I first made contact with him and knew him for a couple of years. I'm happy to say that I talked to Hal in the last days of his life. I called him. He was in hospice care. And I could tell in the background that he was regaling the nurses with tales from the war. So it was a heartwarming thing to know that my friend seemingly had finally found peace. Dale Shabilsky, this is the man who I spoke of who had been tortured by the Soviets. How this man is smiling here, I don't know, given all he went through. He too suffered from PTSD for many, many years, and he too had a loving daughter who prevailed on him to start telling his story. She wanted his grandkids to know what he had done in the war. And he did so. He began to write, he began to speak. He wrote a memoir that I was given sole access to. And I think between his Christian faith and telling the story, he too found peace. He passed away in 2014 at age 89, I believe. And for Hal, that was, he made it to age 90. And last but not least, John Dominy, also known as Duck. If you read the book, you will not forget any of these three men because they are both memorable characters, but also they get quite a bit of time on the page. John was a very happy-go-lucky guy. He didn't struggle mightily with his war experiences, but there were a couple of occasions in which he did. And in one, there was a 19-year difference between John and his baby brother. When he got home from the war, he was taking his brother to play when a car backfired. And to John, that reminded him too much of a detonation of an artillery shell. The next thing he knew, he was taking cover under the front porch, and he later emerged with some shame to find his baby brother playing alone in the street. John passed away in 2016 at age 91, I believe. But these men, what they went through, the book is for them, and it's also for the children, because for the most part, these men did not tell their own families about it, and I was just lucky and blessed to have been the recipient of so many of these stories. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the names, ranks, and units of the 28 Americans who took their final breath over Linz, Austria on April the 25th, 1945. The names are in the book and on my website as well. It's also the story, the book is also the story of the last minutes on earth of my uncle. As I said in my introduction, it's a man I obviously never knew. I wasn't born until many, many years later, but it's a man I've come to love and deeply respect. And in 2012, I visited his grave and pledged to him, as you can see there on the left, that I would tell a story. I had 0.1% of what became this book at that time. I had no business making that promise to him. Of course, I didn't know what telling his story would entail, but I promised him that I would do so. And this past April, I was very glad to keep my promise when I returned to his grave and laid a copy of the book there. So Bombing Hitler's Hometown is a love letter to the men of that generation and of this bombing mission in particular. It's also a love letter to the families, because like I said, and if there are any of you in the audience listening, you probably will say the same thing. I get this more than any other thing when I talk to people. My dad never talked about it. I'm fortunate that I caught so many men at the right time in their lives where they were willing and able to talk about it. And I have to tell you, the experience was so vivid that it was virtually burned into their memories. They were retelling me the most vivid details. And I'll just give you one example and then I'll shut up. Ken Becker, a young man from Lodi, Wisconsin, was a navigator. And on the B-17, the navigator has a lot of windows in the nose section to look out and do his navigation. But Ken never, when they passed over a target, he never took the time to look out those windows. And on his final mission, this mission, which was, I believe, number 17, he finally decided, I'm going to get up and look out the window. Well, he does so, and he said, I saw three colors of smoke. I saw black smoke, white smoke, and brown smoke. He said, I didn't know what that meant, but it scared me to death. That the smoke was Linz burning below him. Well, believe it or not, I did a lot of work in the National Archives, and I found a photo taken from overhead from Ken's bomb group and squadron. And how many types of smoke do you think I saw? White, brown, and black. That is what was burned into the memories of these men. They all took it to the graves with them. At least one man that I know of that I spoke with didn't want to talk about it at all, but for the many others, they did. It was beneficial for me because I could then pass on the story to you all. You know, I hope it was beneficial to them to finally get this off their chest. Anyway, I will leave it here. The QR code there will take you to my website. I treated the website as, you know, if you're familiar with the DVDs or Blu-rays, there's a section called extras where you get bonus content. Believe it or not, the book was much bigger initially. I cut about a third of it. So a lot of the stories that didn't make it into the book are on the website. A lot of the photos I wasn't allowed to use are on the website. My upcoming book signings are there and many other things. So that'll take you there, and that'll also give you the opportunity to buy it if you're interested. Anyway, thank you so much. I was kind of afraid there would be some explosions in the background, but fortunately, I guess it's too early in the evening for that. They usually do that after midnight. But I'm glad to be here, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much. What a powerful story. Yeah, and the fact that you are in the Ukraine right now, amongst all that, just totally, we're I'm going to turn to my live audience first. Yes, question.
Thank you so much for telling the stories. But my husband's uncle, he touched on so many points. He sat in the back of the plane and he shot at other enemy aircraft. And he said many times that he was 19 and he never thought he would make it to his 20th birthday. Other than that, he would never talk about it. My father-in-law would never talk about it. And you did touch on that. Have you, since your book has come out, have you heard from families or surviving family members of some of these people who would not talk about it, who read about things that they never knew?
Yes, ma'am. I've been all over America promoting the book, and I get that more than anything else. My dad, my uncle, my grandfather never talked about it. And that's usually told to me with tears. Because, you know, you all love your fathers, you all respect what they did for us, and you probably in most cases haven't a clue what they did. And that's a shame. That's a shame. So I took it upon myself to give you all a voice, to give you all insights to the extent that a person who wasn't there could give you insights into what it was like. I wrote the book as if I was on the bomber. I tried to visualize. I tried to give a sense of the smells and the sights and the sounds. It's not an easy read. It's not something I'd read before bed. You may not be able to sleep. There are some, you know, humorous incidents, but overall, it's tough because what they went through was tough. So my message to you is, I'm sorry that you don't know what your dad did, but if you want to get a taste, at least get a feeling, at least a little bit of what it was like, I'd invite you to get the book from the library or however you want to read it, and maybe try to find some solace in it.
It froze for a second there, but I think everyone, the Zoom people heard, and I think everybody got the gist of what you're saying. I'm gonna check the chat real quick. A lot of people are saying thank you and talking about their grandfather fought. My dad nor my uncle talk about it. I told Mike before we opened this up to everybody that my dad was a World War II vet. He was in the Navy though, same thing, wouldn't talk about it. Okay, if anybody has any questions in the Zoom, please use the chat. Anybody else in the live audience? I think we're all just kind of taking it in. It's very powerful, very thought-provoking. And I appreciate that you had a slideshow. It makes it more interesting and engaging. I can't move my square. I'm sorry. I don't have control of that. We're doing this live from the Ukraine. It's from Mike's iPad, so I'm sorry for that.
Terry in the chat, I did post the link in the chat. So the QR code link is in the chat. It's just a link to Mike's website.
Thank you, Robert.
My website, by the way, is just my name, MikeCroissant.com. So I apologize if there's a.
Nope, it's fine. Robert took care of it. Robert's always on it. So thank you. And if you don't see it in the chat, you can always contact one of us, Robert or myself, on at our libraries, and we can help you out that way. Everybody's just saying thank you, very powerful. For were those who served not told about their experience? I've heard this. Were those who served told not to talk about their experiences? Sorry, I didn't read it right.
That's a good question. Thank you. The ones who were in Soviet custody, and in particular Dale Shibilsky, they all saw many things about their Russian hosts that they disliked. I mean, they were exposed to a lot of ugly things. They saw firsthand what the Russians were doing in the territories they occupied. I'm sorry to say this, but in many cases, girls, you know, from a young age all the way up to being grandmothers, were raped by the Soviets as they advanced. The men received countless testimonies about this. And in the case of Dale Shibilsky in particular, he was made to sign a written statement pledging not to speak of his treatment at the hands of the Soviets. I was never able to find this affidavit, but he says that it happened. And I think by the time he was finally willing to tell the story, he just sort of said, to heck with it, I'm going to talk about it anyway. But the men, you know, the survivors, and also the ones, I'm sorry, not the survivors, the ones that I spoke with, and also the ones whose journals and diaries that I was given access to, were unanimous in their belief that the Soviets were a malign force and that they should be dealt with, because if they weren't dealt with while we had all the men and material there to do it, we would have to do it eventually. Unfortunately, we know how the history went, and now the Ukrainians here are seeing with their own eyes, you know, what happens when Russian aggression is allowed.
You have a question, Lee?
Yeah, I was wondering if any World War II veterans have read the book and approached him about it.
Have any World War II veterans read your book and approached you about it? As there's starting to hardly be any left, so which is sad. Go ahead.
Sure, I did finish enough of it to send to share with, I think, 3 or 4 men. They were unanimous in telling me that I had gotten it right, that I had gotten the details right. You know, I approached it as, I'm not going to do this unless I can do it right. I took a ride in a B-24. I bought technical manuals for the B-24 and B-17, studied them, so I would know as much as I needed to know about what each man did on the aircraft, you know, the hydraulic system, the landing gear, etc. I wanted it to be authentic. I wasn't gonna, you know, go cheap on this. So I spent years, literally years, becoming familiar with the aircraft, with what the men wore. Keep in mind, these are unpressurized aircraft. They're flying, you know, miles above the ground, where humans can't live without heat and oxygen. So they had to be on an oxygen system above 10,000 feet. They had to wear suits that distributed heat throughout their body. They had to wear body armor over the target. So I familiarized myself with all of these things. And the highest compliment I got was from Hal. I spoke of Hal. He said, you've come very close to describing what it was like that day. So from Hal, that's high praise. And it was the very least I could do for him and the rest of them.
I just want to, a couple people commented on their relatives. I'll get back with it, but someone recommended The Masters of the Air. I think they said it's on Netflix. I'm going to just check chat real quick.
Yeah, it's on Apple TV. It came out
Yeah.
early this year, I believe. I watched it. I found it to be very moving, very powerful. In fact, many of the scenes that I write about in a book are depicted there. It's sort of the last part of a trilogy that includes Band of Brothers and the Pacific. This one covers the air war, and I highly recommend it. You know, it's not 100% accurate, but nothing can be so many years later.
Someone asked, why were the Russians so brutal to humanity?
Oh, that's a
Tough
loaded
question.
question.
Yeah, I was gonna say it is. I just remember Patton in the Band of Brothers book said, so I think that was where I read it, that the Russians were not to be trusted. That was back then, but I don't know.
Right, and they haven't changed. Look, the Russians have a completely different worldview and mindset and view of their own history. We were strictly allies of convenience to them, nothing more. We were ultimately an enemy. And, you know, when you look at the way the war ended, we ended Nazism, but unfortunately, you know, much of Europe ended up under governance that was nearly as bad as that of the Nazis. So we traded one evil for another. Fortunately, the Cold War ended mostly without a shot, but it took, you know, 70 years for these countries to come out from under the Soviet boot. You know, I'm in one of them today, and look what's happened to it. The Russians want it back.
Yeah. Russians also had camps, someone said. Russian, anyway. And somebody said, yes, Apple TV. And, did Hal ever have a religious conversation away from a conversion? Thank you. Religious conversion away from atheism. Sorry about that.
That's the question I get second most. The comment I get the most is my dad never talked about it, and the second one I get is, did Hal convert? Not that I know of, and I say that with a heavy heart. He was just really wedded to the idea that there's nothing beyond, our life here on Earth, and I look back with some regret that I didn't try to nudge him on a different course, but what is what is. But Hal and all of these men were just wonderful. Hal, made me earn his trust, which I really appreciated. He has a background in intelligence as well. When I started to write this book, I was about halfway through my career at the CIA, and I couldn't talk about where I worked, but Hal, I think, could call a spade, and he figured it out and made me earn his trust, which I appreciated. And once he trusted me, there wasn't a question he wouldn't answer.
That's nice.
No matter how sensitive. So I miss him deeply. I was glad I got to talk to him at the very end, and hopefully we'll soon be seeing his widow.
Time, and we really appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to share, and where, especially the location. Robert and I were holding our breath that we would get a connection, and I'm so glad it worked out. And hearing about your leaving Poland and to where you are now, and having
Right.
to travel through the bombing, and
we came over on a train from Poland, and overnight, and while we were on the train, the Russians launched 6 cruise missiles and 23 drones at the Kyiv area. We were still hundreds of miles away, and the Ukrainians have been very effective at downing those. So I don't know that there was any damage at all, but that's life for Ukrainians these days. I told you before the broadcast that we didn't have cell service for a while. The Russians presumably were doing a cyber attack of some kind against the cell network. They've been going hard against the power grid lately. So I was kind of half expecting the power to go out here, but it didn't. So
we made it. We made
thank
it.
you for that.
And thank you for letting. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
We wish you all the best and stay safe. And thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.